Hello, ladies and gentlemen. Dr. Joel Hunter here again with you to study world religions for philosophy 210 at Truckee Meadows Community College. Glad to have you on board now for the discussion of Buddhism. Now, if you remember, our format is going to be to go through a presentation that I have offered to you also as a workbook. So I encourage you to download the PDF of the presentation so that you can fill out some of the content as we go through it and also on your own reading. Now, what we do in these videos is we go through, first of all, the key vocabulary, because to understand the religion in the religion's own terms, you have to kind of get immersed in its own language, and there's going to be unfamiliar terms, and it's important for you to spend some time digesting those, and Smith does an excellent job presenting those definitions. So do have a look at those, and I'm going to list out the ones that you need to know, and I'm going to especially call out the ones I need you to know for the quiz and to answer the challenge question for this week. So then the second part of the video, we're going to talk about what Buddhism, some key questions rather, for you to discover what Buddhism says about the human predicament. What is Buddhism's take on that? The third component is going to be, what is Buddhism's conception of salvation? The fourth component is, of course, the supreme good, according to Buddhism. The higher life. What is the salvation to in Buddhism? All right, and then I'll point out along the path which one of the questions in these lists is your challenge question for this week. And good luck. Let's get over to the screencast right now. All right, so let's take a look at our slides for this week, and giving you the text locations for your readings. Your Smith book, The World's Religions, is pages 82 through 153, and The World's Wisdom, Novak's text, is pages 49 through 109. So do be sure that you've done your reading, and you'll want to annotate as you go along, using some of the vocabulary, circling those vocabulary words as you come across them, and then also writing down what those definitions are. And try to put it in your own words. You demonstrate really grasp and comprehension of the ideas when you can put it in your own words. So do try to paraphrase or summarize the definitions and then the answers to the questions. And you're going to be golden for the quiz. All right, so let's get to it. First section is vocabulary. Let's start right with the name. Where this religion derives its name is Buddha. So what is Buddha? It's not necessarily a specific individual. The most general meaning of the term, look at what Smith says about that. It's the very first thing he talks about. Okay, this is a big one, so make sure you put a star by this. What is dukkha? Dukkha. And if you know the pronunciations better than I do, well, correct me. Drop me a comment in the video or send me an email. I would love to know the correct pronunciations. I'm going as best I can with the phonetic spelling as these are put into English. I think as they're anglicized, they probably lose something of the pronunciation. But I'm doing my best here, and hopefully you'll recognize them if I say them and you don't see the word up there. Next, what is a skanda? Skanda. This is related to the anthropology of Buddhism. What does it say humans are in their essence? And a skanda is essential for understanding that. As I mentioned in the Hinduism video, to understand what a religion says about the human predicament, you have to understand what the religion says about a human. What is a human? In other words, what is that religion's account of human anthropology? So always be looking to answer that category question. And then you can better understand why, not only what religion says about the human predicament then, but why humans are in that predicament. It is often connected to their anthropological ideas. What is tanha? Tanha is another one. Put an asterisk by this one. You really need to know this one. It'll be critical for understanding the model of what Buddhism has to say in answer to the model. What is the Eightfold Path? You see up on the board there, it's kind of dim, I know, because my marker is kind of faded, but you see there a iconic representation of the Eightfold Path. So you need to know what the Eightfold Path is. This is critical, especially when we're looking at what Buddhism says about salvation. Now here's a word you've probably heard, and these are always interesting because a lot of times you have to unlearn things, unlearn incorrect meanings and associations in order to get a better, more faithful representation or understanding of the term. So nirvana, and no, this is not the 90s grunge band. This is not also some sort of vague pie-in-the-sky idea. So you need to look at what nirvana means within the context of Buddhism, of original Buddhism in particular. Okay, another asterisk word, and this is a very key concept in Buddhism, and I'm going to say more about this later because it comes up at more than one occasion, and this is the anatta doctrine. So what is anatta? What does that mean? Another term closely associated with anatta, and in fact, in some respects, you can't understand what anatta means without understanding anicca. So what is anicca? You need to know that word. Now, what is an arhat? An arhat is a role that an individual might fill. It is has a sort of religious as well as a social connotation. Not that those are different things necessarily, but a religious / social / even maybe political position or characteristic. So who or what is an arhat? And connected with arhat is the sangha. So what is a sangha or the sangha? Know what that is. All right, now we're going to talk about a few of the particular streams within Buddhism. Now, as I mentioned in the introduction video, it's important to keep distinct when Smith is talking about the specific teachings within a specific, a sect or a particular expression of a religion that isn't necessarily shared by all. It's important to keep those distinct. In Christianity, which probably more of you are at least somewhat familiar with, these kinds of distinctions, you end up with things like the distinction between Catholicism and Protestantism and Eastern Orthodoxy. Now, they all share a certain set of core beliefs, and they may express them differently, but they basically share the same core-centered set of beliefs and practices. But there are going to be very distinctive beliefs within each of those sects. They'll have different emphases to their beliefs and practices. Okay, so the same is true within all of the major religions. And, Smith he more or less is consistent with this. He'll raise these different sects when it is important to understand a core concept within the overall religion. And so he doesn't go into a lot of depth into each of the sects because that's not his point. He really wants to talk about what is common to all of the different sects so that we can say something about Buddhism or Hinduism in general, okay? So just be aware of that and what I want you to avoid is associating a belief particular to one stream, like Theraveda, and confusing it, say, with Zen. So don't think that Zen Buddhists believe and practice the same things as Theraveda, okay? So just be on the alert for that. But then the main thing I want you to do is connect what the particular sect has in common with all other forms of Buddhism and see, how Smith explains those connections then, okay? I hope that was clear, more or less. Okay, so Theraveda Buddhism, this is the first one you want to know, and then you want to know also where is this prominent? Where in the world is this prominent? Next form of Buddhism is Mahayana. Where is this form of Buddhism prominent? Mahayana. And then Zen Buddhism is a third form and more recent form. So, and this is probably the one most familiar to Westerners who, have some familiarity with Buddhism. And so, there's some controversy about how well Westerners grasp Zen, but for better or for worse, it has been somewhat appropriated in the West, and you want to be sure that your sources, if you're doing research beyond these texts, you want to make sure that your sources are that they are not intentionally sort of picking up ideas from the religion as they're transmitted, and think that those are representative of where Zen Buddhism is found natively. Okay, so not that you shouldn't do that. I'm saying what you don't want to do is assume that a Western interpretation is going to represent the way a practitioner, say in Tibet, is a Zen Buddhist. Okay, very good. All right, next. What is, and this is going to be within Buddhism, within Zen in particular, what is zazen? What is zazen? What is a koan? A koan appears in Buddhism, appears in Taoism especially. We're not talking about Taoism in the semester, but koan is really important because it gets to the heart of one of the issues in Zen Buddhism, which has to do with the limitations of language. And not just the limitations of language, but the limitations of the intellect to be able to grasp the kinds of experiences and realities that they're trying to develop in an enlightened individual. So a koan is one of these tools to help break down the barriers that we sort of natively, naturally put into place with our own language, with our patterns of thought, with our habits of thought, with our assumptions, and so on. So a koan is designed to break those things down. So read about what a koan is and look at some examples too. Finally, what is sanzen? So know what sanzen is. What is satori? Okay, all of these are within the concept of Zen, if I recall correctly. I'm not sure that he connects these last four terms outside of Zen, but check me on that. Okay, fourth form of Buddhism, the fourth sect, is Vajrayana, or Tantric Buddhism, and you want to know where this is prominent. And then who is the Dalai Lama? Again, this is sort of a culturally familiar term and person. So what or who is the Dalai Lama? What is that office? What is that position? And which form of Buddhism, of those sects that I mentioned, the four, which one is he most closely associated with? All right, now we're on to section 2, which is a discussion of the human predicament in Buddhism. And again, human predicament is the situation, the condition in which humans naturally are, according to the religion, and what the cure or prescription is for us to be saved from. We want to be out of this condition. Okay, so if you think of the medical analogy, we're talking about a diagnosis and a prognosis for our state of health, or as the case may be, state of unhealth. And what is our illness? What is, in a different analogy, what captivates us? What keeps us in prison? Okay, that's the human predicament, just as a quick reminder. All right, so let's get to the specific questions that will help you unpack what the human predicament is in your readings. Okay, what insights about the human condition did Siddhartha gain while a prince in his father's house? Smith opens the text with probably about a 3, 4, maybe 5 page overview of Siddhartha's story. And it's a fascinating story, and it does give you sort of a first take on what the human predicament is. And so you can look at things like, what was it about Siddhartha's position, especially since he seemed to have it made? I mean, he was royalty, and he had everything he could possibly want. He had managed to live a life up until a young man starting to make his way in the world, starting to make his way up in the household. He had lived his life utterly untouched by all the negative things in the world, the kinds of things that we associate with the human predicament, the human propensity to F things up, right? That was seen to be missing from his experience, and he had been somehow insulated from that. And so you can look at that even, and this is, I hadn't really thought of this as a way to challenge you, but you can think about that sort of protective shell that his father set around him as itself an expression of the human predicament. I mean, why would he do that unless there wasn't something to protect him from, right? Okay, so have a look at that opening bit in the Smith text. And then how did Siddhartha then, after going about this process of growth, of spiritual insight by experience, by experimentation, by just leaving the house, how did he appropriate these insights to his own condition then? Okay? So this is a great way, and you will actually probably get a lot about the human predicament just out of answering that question. Okay, one of my favorite illustrations in Buddhism is the poisoned arrow. So have a look at the parable of the poisoned arrow. And I will say, I love the Smith text. I wish that he had had a little more to say about the poisoned arrow, since I think it's such a rich parable, a rich illustration of the not only the Four Noble Truths that are wrapped around that, but this specific question about the human predicament, and sort of coming to awareness of what we need to do about the human predicament. So look at what he says about it, but you might want to do your own independent research on this and just do a quick web quest on the parable of the poisoned arrow. Okay, so I just mentioned, what are the Four Noble Truths? And then how would you classify each noble truth within the model? Okay, so I put it here in the human predicament section, but the Four Noble Truths, some of them belong in other parts of the model. But it at least starts, the first noble truth, I will just give that away, the first noble truth is about the human predicament. And then you can look at the second, third, and fourth and see where they fit as well. Okay, big concept within Buddhism is suffering. So, according to Buddhism, how do we suffer? In other words, what are the types of suffering that we endure? How are the different ways we suffer ranked according to the seriousness of the harm they do to us? Okay, so for example, you could say, so you can think about different kinds of suffering, right? So you can think about physical kinds of suffering that you might undergo. So there are things like, even within physical suffering, there's a difference between, say, suffering from an accident that hurts you and then acquiring a disease and something that you've maybe done to yourself, or that is done to you by someone else, right? So even physical suffering has different and important distinctions. And on top of that, then you can say, well, there are other kinds of suffering too. There's mental or psychological suffering. There's emotional suffering. Maybe there's something like spiritual suffering. What does that look like? And then so how does Buddhism account for these different kinds of suffering? And then figure out, does Buddhism distinguish between the seriousness of these different kinds of suffering? Okay, so this is a good question for the human predicament. Okay, big concept within Buddhism is craving. So what do we crave? Besides chocolate ice cream and all those kinds of good things, what do we crave and why do we crave those things? Okay, now this is one to put an asterisk by because it will help you not only in the human predicament to understand what the human predicament is according to Buddhism, but also the other elements, especially the supreme good. So what are the three marks of existence? How do they describe or connect to the human predicament? How do they describe or connect to absolute or unconditioned reality? So there, if you remember, that's sort of a synonym for the unseen order, which is often important to understand what the religion has to say about the supreme good for humans, or the higher life. So that unseen order is in all of the sophisticated religions some form of absolute, some form of unconditioned reality. And so just to make clear about that terminology, that's sort of philosophical jargon there. What do I mean by unconditioned reality? Well, take off the un. What would be a conditioned reality? So that would be something real, but that only exists or has its properties on condition of something else. Okay? So if you think about how things are interconnected with one another, a chain of cause and effect, for example, so you don't get something, for example, the universe is a perfect example of a non-absolute or a relative entity that is conditioned, a conditioned reality, because it only exists as a result of some sort of cause. Okay, now that's actually a philosophical debate about whether the universe has a cause or not. But we know at least that you can't describe the physical universe without, say, the laws of nature. Now, does it make sense to say that the laws of nature are the conditions for this physical reality that we live in, this material universe? Yeah, I think that does make sense. So at the very least, you can point to the laws, the laws of nature as conditions for the existence of the universe that we actually inhabit. Okay, so we can't say that the physical universe is absolute. It's a conditioned reality, not an unconditioned reality. So an absolute or unconditioned reality exists of its own accord, or exists out of its own nature. It is self-existent, is another way we put this. Okay, so that is what we're after, and this is going to come up as you look into the three marks of existence. Okay, so at the very least, you've got those two different kinds of existences, two kinds of being: conditioned and unconditioned, contingent and absolute. Okay, I think I said relative early. I think the better word here is contingent. They exist contingently. Okay, what is the cause of our ignorance and confusion about truth and reality according to Zen? So here I'm asking a question specific to Zen, but I only am asking it here because I think that the answer is actually part of the larger view of Buddhism. It's not limited to Zen. So what's the cause of our ignorance and confusion about truth and reality? All right, so now we're on to part 3, which is salvation. We're talking about now the cure to our illness, which is the way of liberation. What does the religion prescribe for us now that it's given us a diagnosis and a prognosis for our condition? What is the path to freedom, to liberation from our captivity? Okay. What does the name Buddha mean? Now, I've already given you this as a question for your vocab. So this is an easy one. Once you've done the vocab, you can answer this question. And that by this time, you'll be able to understand why this particular term is, I put it in the salvation category of the model. Explain the significance of the bo tree. So this is a story that Smith tells about Siddhartha's path to enlightenment. And one thing I want you to think about as you're reading that is how much importance should be placed on whether or not the account of the bo tree, of what happened with the bo tree, Siddhartha and the bo tree, what importance should be given to whether that's a historical event or not? As I recall, Smith does allude to this question, but I'm not sure he answers it directly. For these kinds of questions, he often does not, I'll just tell you. And I think that's on purpose because he doesn't want to sort of close the door to what anyone might want to investigate for themselves. But this is a question I think that most philosophers would ask, is the historical question. We already know the religion is historical because we can study its history. But what about the specific records of events that transpired in an individual's life from pre-recorded history? So what is the significance then of the bo tree? And you can think about then what is its historical significance, or what difference does it make that it was or was not something that would pass the test of historical critical investigation. Okay, and there I'm saying that if we take modern tools of historical investigation, historical methods, and apply them here, would it matter what those results are to the overall meaning and truth of what the religion claims? Okay, how does Smith and other religious scholars describe original Buddhism? And here, I think this is just a term to capture this idea of what is the core set of doctrines and practices within Buddhism that's common to all of the different sects within Buddhism. So what is that centered set of things? So how do they describe then original Buddhism? Okay, and this is the key question then to the salvation question, is what is the cure to our suffering? We know that we've been, or if you read the parable of the poisoned arrow, we have been shot with a poisoned arrow, or at least it feels that way. And so it would be lovely to know, how do we stop the poison's action? And so what is the cure then to our suffering? Okay, and this is a fun one. And this is, I'm trying to remember if I've done, no, I was considering this one for your challenge question, but I decided not to do this one. But it's a good question. Why is the Eightfold Path a path? Okay, so the Eightfold Path has these 8 components to it, and each of them is preceded with the adjective right. So there's things like right understanding and right speech, right action, right mindfulness, and then 4 others. So why are there 8 components in particular to it? Do you think that's supposed to be comprehensive, that it captures all of the parts of the path that we need for our cure? Or is there something more to this number 8 in the Eightfold Path? So yeah, you want to look at the name and the nature of each of the elements in the Eightfold Path. And I'm trying to remember if I think I did have a follow-up question. Yes, I did. Good. So the Eightfold Path, the right form of each component is described. Okay, so Smith describes this for you. What then, and this entails, now so I'm going to back up. If the Eightfold Path is describing for you the right form of the particular thing, understanding, mindfulness, action, and so on, that entails that there are wrong forms of those things. There's wrong understanding and wrong action and wrong mindfulness. This follows, right? So what would be some examples of wrong forms of each component? Okay, it's nice to know the positive thing, but if you want to sort of do a self-diagnosis, and that's a big part of Buddhism, it would be helpful to not only know the right, but then be able to use what isn't right. What, in other words, what are some of the wrong forms of these various components, so that I can recognize them when I'm in them, when I'm doing them, okay? So have a think about the wrong forms of each component as well as knowing the right forms. Okay, what does Theraveda, and remember this was the first sect I mentioned, what does Theraveda teach is the ideal society? Okay, and this is another time when you may think to yourself, what does this have to do with salvation? Well, sometimes it's not just what it is that brings the cure, that brings us out of captivity, but then there is at the same time that cure is being implemented, or that we are making our way out of a prison, there is already in place, or there is in that process a form of social life, a community, some kind of social component to the religion that's already in place supporting those who are on the path of salvation. So in Theraveda, a notion of an ideal society is in place, or is taught, and so you can think about how that shapes or directs the path of salvation. at least in Theraveda. Okay, so let's move on then, and you notice I haven't gotten to the challenge question yet, and so you know now which category it's going to come from. It's going to come from the third element of the model, and that is the ultimate end or highest good, what salvation is to. Okay. Does Buddhism teach that the boundaries of the finite self can be transcended? Oh, wow, that's a loadful right there. So first of all, you have to break this down into manageable parts. So the finite self. Does that mean that if I'm specifying a finite self, does that mean in Buddhism that there's a notion of infinite self? Well, we saw that in Hinduism, right? And then you'll read in the Buddhism chapter about the connection between Hinduism and Buddhism. So, yeah, the finite self then is a particular form of the self. It isn't the whole self. Now, a lot of people will think that if oneself is nothing but the physical, or is nothing but the material, or is nothing but some combination of space, time, and energy, well, then that would be it, right? There only would be a finite self that when it has run its course, when it dies, in other words, that's that. There's no transcendence. Okay, so it's important to understand whether Buddhism teaches that the finite self can be transcended or not. Okay? And to know what those boundaries are, the finite self. There are other possible boundaries to a finite self than just physical ones. So do bear that in mind. I don't mean to imply that the only conception of boundaries on finitude are physical. There could be other things, could be immaterial things as well. Okay. What is the absolute or the unconditioned reality according to Buddhism? Now, I already alluded to this back when I was talking about the Four Noble Truths. So now you can put that discussion here as well. You know, which of the Noble Truths talks about absolute unconditioned reality, and what is the vocabulary that Buddhism uses to describe this? I'm using philosophical vocabulary. What does Buddhism use in its vocabulary? So what is that ultimate reality according to Buddhism? Okay, how does Buddhism describe union with the absolute unconditioned reality? Okay, so there's a frequent idea in most of the sophisticated religions of the world that describe what the state of total freedom is, or of total liberation, of the higher life that can be experienced. There's some, in almost all cases that I can think of at least, there is at some point some sense of union with this higher unseen order, divine reality, whatever it is called, this absolute or unconditioned reality. So you'll be seeing that more than just here in Buddhism. In fact, you've already seen it in Hinduism as well. But how does Buddhism in particular describe this union? And then what are the properties of nirvana? I mentioned nirvana earlier in the vocabulary, so now is the time to understand how nirvana fits within this economy of the model where it is part of this supreme good. So what are the properties of nirvana? Okay, here is your challenge question. And this is the one that is going to be on your quiz, and it will be worth 10%, an extra 10%, I should say, of the value of your quiz. And I will have it posted for you. This is not the full form of the question, but it's the gist of it. But I will have the full form of the question posted in an announcement for you. So have a look at that, and then you can prepare your answer ahead of time and make sure you meet all the requirements that I list there, like the word count and junk like that. So yeah, you can have that answer prepared beforehand so that you can just, when you open up the quiz, you don't have to sit there composing 200 words. You can just copy and paste it because there's a time limit, right? So you don't want to be wasting your time with that. Okay, so what is the relationship between the anatta doctrine and nirvana? Okay, so I mentioned earlier that anatta was one of those asterisk words in the vocabulary list, right? So this is why it's important for you to know. This is really central to Buddhist thought in general. What is the relationship between the anatta doctrine and nirvana? Okay. What is, and this is the final question for this presentation, what is the ultimate destiny of the human spirit? Now, there's a loaded term there, spirit, right? Now, Smith uses the term frequently, and don't get thrown off. You know, this is not like some sort of ghostly self. All right, never make that mistake. I can't think of a single real religion where there's a conception of a human self, a human spirit. Let me rephrase that. A human self in spirit form that has anything to do with like a ghostly you or me. It has nothing to do with anything like that. That would be sort of a coarser forms of a religion, you know, not representative of the most sophisticated expressions of it, the ones that have stood the test of time, and so on. So don't get tripped up by the term spirit here. See if you can figure it out. I'll give you a little hint though. So when you think about the different senses that spirit can have, I mean, the one I want you to take off the table is this idea of the ghost. Okay, you're not going spirit hunting here, but it is instead something much closer to, although not identical to, the idea of someone who, if you say someone has a lot of spirit, what are you saying about them? You know, you're talking about a kind of life that they live, right? You're talking about a kind of energy that they have. So if you say somebody has a lot of spirit, you're saying something about them, about their character, maybe even about their behaviors. That's a lot closer to the sense that sophisticated religions mean. Now, that, again, I say that's not identical, but that's much closer. Okay, very good. Well, ladies and gentlemen, we are actually done. Let me just pop over to the full screen here. So, hello. So yeah, we are done for the Buddhism presentation. I hope this was helpful. Again, I really encourage you to make use of these presentations that I've uploaded as PDFs for to use as a workbook. Take your notes and stuff. And I'll see you next time for Judaism. Take care and good luck on that quiz.